The role and status of women in ancient Sparta. Women played an important role in Spartan society as they did in other ancient societies. The Spartiate women played an important role, such as the bearers of children, the mothers of warriors, heiresses, and the managers of estates. Now, it's important to remember that Spartiate women were the higher class women. There was different types of people in Sparta. You had the Spartiates, who were the top class, and then you had the Helots and the Perioikoi. So the Spartiate women were the highest. And they could be heiresses, right? They could inherit land, and they managed the estates. So that was a very important role. The Helot women also performed a vital role. They were domestic and agricultural functions. So they worked the land. They did the hard work that other people wouldn't want to do. The voice of women. The female voice of Sparta is not heard. We don't have any ancient diaries that the Spartan women kept. We don't have any ancient women writers that have handed down their writings over the centuries. So we don't know what women were really thinking. We don't know what women were really feeling. And because of this, we are entirely reliant on sources by men. So this is a bit unfortunate, and the men might be biased, the men might be inaccurate, and even if they try their best, they're never going to know exactly what was in the mind of the women. So we don't really know what the Spartan women were thinking. Xenophon was an Athenian soldier, and he spent some time in Sparta in the late 5th and early 4th century BC. Now, just a note about his name. The name Xenophon is pronounced as if it has a Z. So don't get too confused about that. Just pretend there's a Z there. And Xenophon was an Athenian soldier, so he was actually from the rival city of Sparta. The Athenians and the Spartans were great rivals. They were always competing with each other. They even had the Peloponnesian War with each other. And of course, Sparta won the war and became the dominant power for some time. So at face value, you might think, oh, Xenophon is probably not a very trustworthy source. He was an Athenian. He probably didn't like the Spartans. He's probably said a lot of bad things about them to badmouth them and make them look bad. But in reality, he is a fairly trustworthy source because he spent some time in Sparta and he even owned an estate there. So he did have some regard for Sparta, and I think he's a fairly trustworthy source. Aristotle was one of the great intellects of ancient Greece. He was a philosopher. He was the tutor to Alexander the Great, and of course he wrote about history as well. And Aristotle wrote in the 4th century BC, and he was highly critical of Sparta. So that's an important thing, that's an important source that we can use, but it's important to keep an open mind. Aristotle came from the rival city, he was very critical of them, so we just need to keep an open mind because he might have been a bit biased towards the Spartans. Women supported the military. Remember, Sparta was a great militaristic society. Everyone in Spartan society, including women, was expected to support the military ethos in which the society was based. Spartiate women had considerably more freedom than the women of Athens. Spartan women were encouraged to play an active social role. The main function of upper-class Spartan women was similar to that of their Athenian sisters: to be wives and mothers of citizens. And Xenophon said that for the Spartiate woman or free woman, childbearing was the most important function. So once again, this role of childbearing was very, very important. Women's education. Now this might be a bit of a surprise. I mean, this is the ancient world, and it was a militaristic society, and women tended to be second-class citizens in the ancient world, and yet despite this, women did have an education. 2,300 years ago, 2,400 years ago in ancient Sparta, women had an education. A Spartan man's life revolved around the military and being a soldier. But Spartan women were educated to be the proper mother of warriors in a warrior state. Education for girls. The Spartan education system was controlled by the state. So it's a little bit similar to a modern society. I mean, even in Australia today, we have a government, the state, which controls education. They collect taxes, they pay for the schools, they decide what we should learn at school, they set the curriculum and so on, they set the standards for teachers. So, it's quite surprising that 2,400 years ago, 2,500 years ago, the Spartan government was in control of education at that time in their city. Young Spartan girls remained at home with their mothers, but they were still expected to be educated. It is believed the Spartan girls were taught the basics of reading and writing. Girls' groups. Girls were organised into bands similar to the boys for team games and choral singing. So you might have a choir, a group of students all singing songs together, like at Christmas time when you have Christmas carols. Xenophon wrote about Spartan girls and says it was Lycurgus who prescribed their upbringing. Remember Lycurgus, the great lawgiver who sort of set all the standards for Spartan society. He also set the standards for the upbringing of girls. Lycurgus considered slave girls quite adequate to produce clothing and thought that for free women the most important job was to bear children. In the first place, therefore, he prescribed physical training for the female sex no less than for the male. So isn't that interesting? He wanted to have nice, fit, young, healthy girls who can make good babies, and he prescribed them to do physical training just as much as the men. Next, just as for men, he arranged competitions of racing and strength for women also. So they had a lot of competitions in ancient Greece. Remember, it was the Greeks who founded the Olympic Games. In 776 BC, they had the first Olympics, and Lycurgus wanted to have competitions for the girls, not just for the boys. So competing in sport would be fun and something enjoyable for them. Spartan girls were married in their late teens. Spartans were expected to marry in their own social class, by which a man would choose a bride. Carry her off is thought to have taken place. Now, this is a little bit controversial. They're not sure exactly what happened. Some people say it may have been more of a symbolic thing, not really that they would steal a girl and take her away against her will. It may have just been more of a symbolic thing. And this was called marriage by capture. So this does suggest a lack of choice on the girl's part, but A.J. Ball suggests that Spartan mothers did in fact have some say in whom their daughters married. This suggests a lack of choice on the girl's part. A.J. Ball suggests that Spartan mothers did in fact have some say in whom their daughters married though. Marriage by capture. The actual capture was probably a symbolic act. It is thought that a prenuptial wedding feast took place. And once again, I think this is quite surprising because in today's world, when a man and woman get married, you might have a man who will have a bucks party the night before the wedding. The women have a hens party before the wedding. But even in ancient Sparta, they'd have a wedding feast before the wedding. So I just think it's so interesting. I mean, these people lived thousands of years ago. They didn't have cars, they didn't have aeroplanes, they didn't have electricity. But they were people, just like us. And their life seems to be very similar to ours, except they just didn't have the technology. And I just find that really amazing. Women's power. Married women in Sparta exercised much more control and influence in their society than did their Athenian counterparts. And once again, this is a bit surprising because Athens is considered to be, by many, the superior city, and Athens is the one that has survived until today. But it was actually the Spartan women that had a bit more power and control. They took no part in the communal life of men, so they did have a bit of a separation of the sexes, and they could not vote. But they played an important role in the transfer of property. Women and land ownership. Wealth in Sparta revolved around land ownership. The land was owned and controlled by the upper class Spartiate families. At the beginning of the classical period, a Spartan woman could inherit land. but she didn't own it. So this is quite an interesting thing. She's got the land, but she doesn't really own it. It was passed to her offspring. By the end of the classical period, Aristotle and Xenophon inform us women did own and manage estates without male guardians. So things did change in the society. Towards the end of the classical period, Aristotle noted that women in Sparta owned 2/3 of the land. So over time, they've inherited land, they've accumulated land, and it's built up, and more women have ended up with the land. Aristotle feared that this would lead to government by women. So naturally, it seems a little bit sexist now, doesn't it? He was concerned that women would get too much land, they'd get too much power, you'd end up with a government ruled by women, because there was a democracy in Sparta. So Aristotle was a bit concerned about that. So maybe he was a bit sexist at that time, but that was his concern.